Welcome to African Affairs. We are in the studio of DCTV, Washington, D.C., United States of America. Today my guest is my colleague here, who has been with me since the inception of this program, Professor Alem Hailu. Professor Alem Hailu is a professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. Welcome again to the program, Professor Alem Hailu.
Thank you.
Today we're going to discuss Libya. Libya is on the fringes of North Africa. It has been on the news recently with its leader, Moma Gadafi. He was a colonel in the army and overthrew the royal monarchy, the head of the royal monarchy, King Idris, in 1969. Today, 42 years in office as the head of state of Libya. Professor Alem Hailu, what I want to get, what were the circumstances that led to his overthrow of the government of Libya? Was the economy in shambles? Is that because of his own ambition?
I mean now or in 69?
In 1969?
69.
Yes.
In 1969, King Idris was in charge of a monarchy. He had some semblance of democracy, not quite. It was authoritarian, but he had a two-chamber parliament, where the upper parliament would be handpicked by him, but the lower parliament. Though it had its share of economic problems. Oil wasn't there until some time back. But the thing that drove the Gaddafi calls it a revolution, and others call it a coup d'etat. But anyway, it was a 1969 coup d'etat that was staged by Gaddafi and his officers' corps. He got his inspiration from Egypt, Colonel Nasser's coup d'etat, which established a pan-Arab type of government in Egypt. So in fact, there is a story that said when he took to power, people were sent from Egypt to see how they were, if they were like the Egyptian officers, and they came back and they said, yes, they are like us, they have all the rhetorics, but they're also scary. So it inaugurated a time when he was spouting revolutionary zeal, pan-Africanist, pan-Arab movement. He was for Arab unity and nationalism, and leftist rhetoric also. So what led to it perhaps was some economic problems, but was mainly the movement of young officers who wanted to change, a break from the tradition of a monarchy into a socialist, Arab socialist type of government.
Okay, now, the question I always ask, why has he been in power for so long? Is that his authoritarian method, authoritarian method of holding the people of Libya, or are the Libyans faring good under his leadership? What are the contributing factors?
That's a very difficult question because it raises the issue, why are people rebelling now? There was a book that said, entitled, I think, a professor in University of Maryland who wrote some years ago about why do men rebel, why do people rebel? Mm-hmm. And another one came up with a choice, why do they not rebel?
Okay, that's what I'm asking now.
So why didn't they rebel the last 40 years?
Yes,
what is it that happened now that led to the rebellion?
Yes.
I don't think we can give a full answer, but to just touch some of the factors that led to the rebellion. One, for 40 years, he was led by the revolutionary zeal, where he had ideas and institutions that were authoritarian in many ways, but tapped into the world Cold War rhetoric of independence, anti-colonialism, so that played a part. And secondly, it was very repressive, very authoritarian. Thirdly, Libya is an oil-rich country. It has something like 55 million barrels of oil reserve, similar amount, about 50 feet of gas.
Natural gas.
So that cushion, he distributed the money, and it created a sort of totalitarian state where there were local institutions that permitted all aspects of the society. So that's why there was no rebellion the last 40 years. But what triggered now is what has been termed as the Arab Revolution or the Jasmine Revolution, which started in Tunisia, moved to Egypt. And we can go into some of the explanations into why it started, but these are the factors that fueled the uprising of the youth. They were at the forefront of the change. And we can throw in other factors, but that's something we can discuss.
Okay, now, we are now talking about why they are rebelling now. I have been reading about the totalitarian nature of Gaddafi's government. I have not heard about hardship among the people. I have not heard about unemployment among the people. That is where now we are coming into why the rebellion at this time. We know that he has been in power for 42 years. Is that enough reason to rebel against Gaddafi? How have the people fared under his regime? Do they have water? Do they have electricity? Do they have good roads? Do they have food supply?
That's a very good question, because it goes to the bottom, to the root of explanations for why revolutions take place, why are uprisings, why do people rise. And a lot of times they found out that really oppressed people don't rise. And one of the theories that they bring up is what they call the J curve. They say people rebel, people revolt, not when they're really down, but when their expectations are quashed. When sometimes, in fact, when things improve, but don't improve to the extent that they expected. So Libya is not one of those countries where they have famine, displacement, abject poverty. He has distributed some. There was a relatively, but in terms of satisfying the needs of the populations. In fact, many of the rebels say, even in Egypt and other parts, they say it's not about material things. It's about dignity. It's about their expectations. And even though people are not suffering from starvation, from hunger, there is very high, disproportionate unemployment among the youth. Some even estimate like 30% of the young people were unemployed. And there is a big condition where the state is the big employer. But particularly with privatization, their aspirations were arrested. And they say that's the reason they have revolted. But also it's the way he has managed the change also, the repression, that might have fueled this. But in terms of the classical explanation of people who are really oppressed rising, it wasn't the most depraved, the most poverty-stricken country, but in terms of repression, of course, it's a repressive government. It imprisons its opposition. There is no freedom of opinion. There is no, but in terms of economic conditions, as the most abject, Libya is not in that sense.
Okay, now the people are rebelling. The protest started February 2011. Before this protest, what has been his relationship with the West? He has been accused of assembling materials for nuclear weapons, has been accused of masterminding and supporting and encouraging acts of terrorism, the downing and the destruction of Flight 103 over Lockheed, Scotland, in 1988 was the thing that aggravated every peace-loving nation on earth. what is your intake on these these activities of Moma Gadafi? Why would he engage in terrorism? Why would he like people in other areas to be killed? I was told that some of Libyan nationals in exile, he would send hitmen against them in the countries where they are domiciled.
Yes, Gaddafi has been one of the most repressive one-party rulers in the continent or elsewhere. During his 40-year rule, he has tried to repress dissent. Even some of his comrades, he has subjected them to jail. Or there's been instances where, particularly in 1983, he hunted his opponents, even outside, who lived as dissidents in terrorist acts. His terrorist support of armed groups in many parts of the world, from IRA in Ireland, Comoros in the Philippines, in the Sudan, in Ethiopia. He financed the rebellions in Liberia and Sierra Leone. So he's been known for destabilizing societies, for sending terrorist acts. He was responsible for the Lockerbie flight in Scotland. He was responsible for another flight from Brazzaville to Paris that was blown up in the air. He did all this. But the ironic thing is, after he was cornered by the international community, almost in the late 80s, he wanted to come clean because it was having an impact on him. He couldn't have the development he wanted. Many of the embargo was having an impact on growth in the country. So he had a change of mind, and communism had also ended. So he tried to make peace with the West. He came clean with his nuclear programs. He even exposed many of the terrorist links he had. He renounced terrorism. He tried to adapt privatization and not as maybe as far as many would want. But that's the irony. That's when in fact they asked his son if there were lessons he learned from this. His lessons wasn't that they should have been more open, more tolerant, but he said, our mistake was not buying enough arms from the east, from Russia. we should have. So you can draw your conclusions. But this was the conclusion he drew, because when he didn't convert into a saint, but he had come a little ways from his old times when he was radically supporting terrorists. Not that he had stopped, but he had moderated somehow, and then he was cornered by history and the irony of what is going on now.
Yes, you mentioned the oil deposits that found in Libya. They are rich in oil, and it's a country of about 51 million people. So how has he used the oil money? I was told that he has built financial empires all over Europe and America, where he has hoarded money. And when he visits here, he doesn't go to expensive hotels. He stays, he puts up a tent where he stays. What is going on with Gaddafi?
It ties in with his idiosyncrasy. On the one hand, he is for the people. In fact, he said he abolished the central government because he believed in the people ruling themselves. But underneath that, he was the one that was in charge, that was pulling the levers of power. He talks about simplicity in the tent, but he's not that simple in his lifestyle, in the billions of dollars of investments he has in his name and in his children's names. And that's been one of the issues that was raised in what's been going on in Tunisia and in Egypt. And there is the one researcher called Roderick, and he mentioned that many of these countries, by studies by the UN, had improved economic conditions, but what was exposed by the social media, by globalization, by exposing of population, young people, to what is going on in the world. Their expectations were they could not anymore hide what was going on, as happened in Tunisia. His wife and he how they were wasting millions while people didn't have enough money for food.